So today is my birthday. It's my 61st birthday, which means I was born in 1959 in Chicago. One of the stories that I don't like to tell, but will, is that the day I was born, so I was born to a family of modest means. In other words, we were poor. And I was born in a hospital in a place called Melrose Park, which is in Chicago, in the outskirts of Chicago. And my parents didn't have enough money to actually pay the bill. So what they would do is make you stay longer. So I ended up, apparently as an infant, I don't recall this, but my mother did, staying there for a couple of extra days because we couldn't afford to leave. And so that's the kind of humble beginnings I came from. But one of the things that I've always been acutely aware of is the fact that because I was born a white man in Chicago in 1959, that I was twice as likely to not die, to be able to live through infancy, right? So my mortality rate was half of what a black man would have been at that time. I was 3 more times likely to not live in poverty, to not remain in poverty, but to be able to come out of that. I was 6 times less likely to go to prison. I was twice as likely to not be killed by police. My wealth today is, if I were born black in this country, my wealth today would be 10 cents white family is. So the median white family in the US today has the wealth of about $170,000 as a buffer in comparison to the median wealth of a black family, which is about $17,000. So it's, a significant difference. I also, if I was born black in this country, would have had a much higher likelihood of being exposed to trauma early on and throughout my life. And I would have been 3 times as likely to have my mother die in childbirth, maternity mortality. And the fact that I'm here today, being able to work and speak with you, is also extremely influenced by the color of my skin and the fact that I was born a white man in America. The 13.4% of the population of America is African American, but in elite colleges, the representation of Black Americans is very low. I'm proud to say it's the highest of all elite colleges at Columbia, and has been for a long time, but it's still only like 7% of the faculty population of Columbia. It's 2.2% at Harvard. And most other institutions are certainly lower than Columbia. So the fact that I'm here also has not been unaffected by the fact that I'm white. And so growing up in Chicago, when I did, which is sort of mostly in the 60s, I was very aware of the fact that conflict and protest and movements were a powerful force in this country, because I grew up again I was in Chicago around 1968. So there were nonviolent protests. King was in Chicago at that time, and he was organizing, and there were protests against the Vietnam War. There was also brutal reprisal of the police. Mayor Daley was the mayor at the time, was a sort of vicious mayor. And so they used excessive force against the protesters at that time. And so I remember that, as an 8-year-old, growing up in that environment, we would go downtown and have a sense of the protesters and have a sense of the chaos in the streets. So that was very formative for me. It really sort of kept me awake to that. And so, what I want to emphasize tonight, which again, as I say, is unlike what we usually do, is to talk a little bit about this movement that's a nascent movement that started about a week ago. Can everybody see my screen? Amy, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So a movement started a week ago, and it I think is to some degree fed by this quote by Martin Luther King. So he said this in to the masses that marched on Washington for civil rights in 1963. He said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." And this was a theme that King spoke about and wrote about several times in 1963 in April of that year before this. In his letter from Birmingham jail, he spoke about the urgency of nonviolent civil disobedience now. And that sometimes you need to increase what he called constructive tension. And then he also wrote about it in a speech, a fantastic speech, if you haven't ever read it, at Riverside Church, which is just down the block from where we usually have class. A speech that he called Beyond Vietnam, where he really criticized the American government for its role in Vietnam, and again talked about the critical urgency of moments like this to sort of mobilize ourselves. So it was in that spirit that I was moved by the reality of this group. This is Thea Butler and Kevin Gannon. They're two academics. She's at Penn, he's somewhere in Des Moines at a university. And they just tweeted, they were inspired by the WNBA and the NBA and their boycotts and strikes of their work and the sort of shutdown to bring attention to the Black Lives Matter movement and to the crisis that is once again continuing to unfold in America. And they really sort of called out to academics to participate in this strike. So yesterday and today there have been strikes by faculty member across the country. I think today and tomorrow in Canada, there are other faculty that are striking up there. And so in lieu of a strike, I wanted to take some time to begin the class with the issue of racism and anti-racism and its effect on our thinking and action in conflict, because it's such a critical component to this class. And this is such an acute time that to not speak to it, to not address it, I think would do us all a disservice. So this is the website for this movement. There's information there. There's been a 2-day teach-in. So there are videos posted from faculty all over the country that have been uploading content about what they're speaking to. And what I want to speak to is how something has really affected me in our work. So Morton Deutsch spent his life in working on constructive conflict, but really spent the sort of latter half of his career on social justice and overcoming oppression and trying to understand systems of oppression and why they're so hard to change. And so we organized a lot of energy and time at the center at the end of his life on those issues. And one of the things that I've always been struck by, and we'll talk more about this in a few weeks, is the kind of countervailing tensions between the conflict resolution field, how in conflict resolution, what we're often trying to do is de-escalate tensions, find common ground, find harmony, prevent violence, prevent destruction. And the social justice movement, in contrast, is often trying to increase tension. It's trying to increase attention to injustices and to grievances. And it is trying to mobilize, it's trying to, what Mort would say, is awaken a sense of injustice, to awaken the consciousness of a people or a country to things that are just clearly wrong, but that's for whatever reason we tolerate. And so those two things, they sort of need to increase tension in order to get the attention of those in power, and the need to decrease tension, or at least to find a way to strike what we call optimal tension, to find a zone within social movements and within change initiatives that is sufficiently demanding those empowered to make necessary reforms, but not so much so that it shuts things down. And this is something that King referred to in his letter from Birmingham as constructive nonviolent tension. He said, nonviolent direct action seeks to create a crisis and establish creative tension, that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront an issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive violent tension that is necessary for growth, just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal. We must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create, help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. So he, of course, lived nonviolence. It was a powerful movement demonstrated by Gandhi, and first in South Africa and then in India. He was very schooled in it, very strategic about it, very adaptive in his approach to it. But I've always been inspired by that, and I've been inspired by his thinking about conflict and tension and the value of that to awaken a sense of consciousness or conscience amongst the people. So this is something that we've worked on at the center for several years. We published a paper that you'll read down the line. This was essentialized in the piece that I sent you a couple of days ago in the Hill about police reform and what works and what doesn't. And this was really a paper written because of our sense that change around racial injustice and really diversity, equity, inclusion in general, institutional change on these issues is so acutely slow and so beset by setbacks that we wanted to try to think about it differently and to try to understand the conditions. So that's what this initiative is about. And that's what we'll talk much more about this in a few weeks when we talk about multiculturalism and conflict. But this was inspired by this need to understand this sort of nexus of conflict resolution and social justice and where they meet in ways that actually mobilize real reform. So in service of that, what I wanted to do by shifting the conversation around conflict and race to you and to your understanding of conflict and your experience of conflict and how your race and ethnicity have affected for a 20-minute-ish conversation. And at that time, I'd like you to talk about two things. One is, how does your own race or your ethnicity affect your understanding and experience of social conflict? And how might your race or ethnicity affect your responses to conflicts over incidents involving racial injustice? Now, not all of you are in the US, but in the US, for the past several months, there has been a resurgence of awareness and mobilization on anti-racist movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been around since 2014, has sort of reached another crescendo. And so it's been in the context, and this boycott is just another attempt to basically keep attention and tension at a level that mobilizes. And so I wanted to take the opportunity when we're beginning class and starting to think about how do we think about conflict, how do we understand it, how do we respond to it, what's good conflict, what's bad conflict, when we're struggling with our own sort of theories, implicit theories of conflict. I wanted you to begin by thinking about this issue, and to have a conversation in these small groups where you listen and try to learn as respectfully as you can. These would be small groups of 3. You'll have only 20 minutes to have this initial conversation. I welcome you to continue the conversation afterwards if you so like or wish. But let's start here today. And then when we come back, we'll debrief this a little bit. And then we'll move back into the sort of planned course and go over the syllabus and continue with what was planned in your readings. But I really wanted us to begin with our thinking and feeling and experience of conflict as it's connected to our race and ethnicity.